Senator from Maine.
Mr. President. Mr. President, shortly the Senate will consider the debt ceiling package that passed the House last night by a strong vote. I commend the Speaker for his hard work and his negotiations to prevent what would be a disastrous default with catastrophic consequences for our economy, for people who rely on important government programs, for America's standing in the world. Nevertheless, Mr. President, there are two issues in this package that are very problematic. First, as you have heard from my colleagues, is the completely inadequate top-line number for our national defense. Second is a harmful provision that would go into effect if any one of the 12 appropriations bills has not been signed into law. It would trigger an automatic MEDAX indiscriminate across-the-board cut in our already inadequate defense budget and in the domestic discretionary non-defense funding. This would happen automatically if, in fact, all 12 appropriations bills have not been passed. Now, let me address both of those issues and offer to my colleagues what I believe are solutions. First, the inadequacy of the defense budget. As my colleagues have very well described, the defense budget submitted by President Biden and included in this as the top line in this package is insufficient to the task of fully implementing the national defense strategy at a time when we face serious and growing threats around the world. As my friend and colleague from South Carolina and Alaska and others have already described, this budget request would actually shrink the size of our Navy. We would end up with a fleet of 291 ships. That is 6 ships fewer than today's fleet of 297 ships. And it is further away from the Chief of Naval Operations requirement, which is informed by scenarios involving China, for example. Meanwhile, what is China doing? China has the largest Navy in the world now, and it is growing to 400 ships in the next 2 years. The story's very similar if you look at the Air Force tactical aircraft. So we have a real problem. Let me give you another example. It's an example that all of us can relate to who fill our cars with gas or seek to heat our homes. This budget request falls woefully short in funding the fuel costs of our military. The Government Accountability Office says that DOD's fuel costs are likely to be 20% higher than the amount of money that is included in the President's budget. Mr. President, I asked the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, what the result would be. And he says it very clearly. It would translate into 20% fewer flying hours and steaming days, which would harm our military's training and readiness. So that's a very concrete area where the president's budget is clearly not going to be adequate. Second, Mr. President, is the harmful provision with the automatic 1% cut across the board. Well, think about this if you are the Secretary of Defense. Let's say the Department of Defense appropriations bill is signed into law before the start of the fiscal year in October, as I hope that it will be and am working hard. Doesn't matter. Let's say the Ledge Branch appropriations bill isn't signed into law by January 1st of next year. An order goes out that has to be implemented by April 30th, which would cut every account across the board by 1%. How does that make sense? Think how harmful that would be. How in the world is the military going to enter into contracts if it doesn't know what its budget is going to be, despite the fact that its appropriations bill has been signed into law, but because of this threat hanging over the department? So what do? I don't want to see our country default for the first time in history. I do believe that would have catastrophic consequences, but we need to fix these problems. Well, the first problem of an inadequate defense budget could be addressed and remedied by having an emergency defense supplemental. That is what we need to do. That is what I would ask the administration and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to commit to, because we know that this budget is not adequate to the global threats that we face. We know that it does nothing to deter Russian aggression in Ukraine. We know that it's not adequate to the challenge that we face from China. An emergency supplemental must be coming our way to remedy the first problem. What should we do about the second problem? The threat of this 1% indiscriminate MeToo cut across the board. We need to pass each and every one of the 12 appropriations bills on time before the start of the fiscal year. And in order to do that, I am working very hard with the chair of the committee, Senator Murray. But we need a commitment from the Senate Majority Leader that he will provide us with floor time. We will do our utmost to get every single one of the 12 appropriations bills marked up and reported out of the Appropriations Committee. But then I am asking the Senate leader, Majority Leader, to commit to bringing each of those bills to the Senate floor, either singly or individually, or as mini buses, as we used to do, where we would pair a couple of the bills together. But it's essential, and I would implore the Democratic leader to provide the commitment that he will bring each of the appropriations bills to the Senate floor so that we can avoid the threat of this indiscriminate across-the-board cut. So, Mr. President, I believe that that is the path forward for us, an emergency defense supplemental to make up for the woefully inadequate budget that has been submitted by this administration for the Department of Defense, for our national security. And second, to prevent the 1% cut from ever being triggered, a commitment that all of the appropriations bills will be brought on time to the Senate floor. Then it seems to me we can proceed with this package and avoid a catastrophic default for our country. Thank you, Mr. President.